Courtney. I'm back here with another design team project for Scrapping for Less. Today I'm going to be using the Young Love stamp set by Penny Black, and I have a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock here, and this will eventually be die cut down, so I'm not worried about the size at this point. I am using my stamp positioner just because this is such a large image in case I have to stamp it twice. It has a ton of detail to it. Usually the red rubber stamps do have a lot more detail than the clear stamps. So I want to make sure that I'm getting all of those details. I am stamping with Blackout ink by Ink on 3. You'll just want to make sure that you're using a Copic safe ink, and we'll jump right into the coloring. And I have this sped up just a little bit because the coloring did take a little bit of time. I'm going to start off with the skin tones. I'm going to start with her, and her skin tones will be slightly lighter than his. So I start off with my lightest color to map out my darkest areas. There's going to be a shadow off to the right-hand side because her face is kind of tucked under his, and on the bottom portion of her hands, going in with the darkest color and going over those same areas that we had mapped out, blending that out with the two mid-tones, then going back to my lightest color. I am paying attention to the wrinkles in her face and creating a little bit of shadow with those as well, and blending those out each time. Also, there would be a shadow where because her face is kind of tilted, her nose would also create a shadow. For him, I'm basically doing the same thing. I'm just going to go a little bit darker, but just paying attention to those lines and those wrinkles in his face. And it looks like they have their eyes closed, so I am creating a little bit of a shadow underneath their eyes as well. Now, he does have his arm wrapped around her, and I did miss his hand at this point. I just didn't see it, but I will notice that later on, and we'll go back and fix that up. Now, like I said, I am using a lot of the same colors as for both skin tones. I'm just going a little bit darker than hers, so I'm skipping the highlight color for her and then going one step darker for his shadow colors. We'll jump right into their hair, and there's not a whole lot of hair showing, but I did want to make their hair to be gray. So my darkest color is going to be the C5, and I'm just putting a little bit of shading underneath her hat and where their hair would be parted, blending that out with the C3, and then finally the C1 for the highlight. Next, we'll move on to her dress, and I'm using 5 different colors here, and this is not a requirement. But I am, like always, starting off with my lightest color to map out those darkest areas, and I'm paying attention to the details within the image itself. You can kind of see that there's some folds within her dress. I'm using those to my advantage to create some texture to her dress. I'm also adding a few on my own too, with just basically a flick line from the bottom portion of her dress. I also created a shadow underneath where her hands are kind of resting on her dress, and then where her little waist is, I'm creating a little bit of a shadow on either side just because this would be more of a rounder object, and her sweater is hanging over that as well. For my darkest color, I went over those same areas. Now you can see that I took both caps off my marker. It was just because the marker wasn't, the ink, I guess, was flowing out a little bit too much. And if you notice this happening, just remove both caps, and this will kind of even out the pressure within the marker itself and make it so that you're not getting those globby marks. If you notice that it's coming out too fast or your lines are too thick, make sure that you take off both caps immediately, because if not, you're risking getting a big blob coming out on your card. And the darker the color it is, the harder it is going to be to take that up. So I blended that out each with all my midtones, and then I'm moving to the lightest color and just blending all of those areas out. Like I said, I use those folds to my advantage, and you just want to make sure that you're shading in the same direction each and every time. For her hat, I'm using the same color combination, just putting a little bit of shading behind or where her hat is behind him, and then up from the bottom, but using all of the same colors. For her shirt or her blouse, I wanted to make this white, so I'm just going to use some C markers just for the shading. There would be some shading where her sweater is underneath or over her blouse, and also on the collar, blending that out with the C3, and then finally the C1, just leaving a little bit of white space so that the blouse still appears to be white. For her sweater, oh, this is where I realized I forgot his hand. So back to her sweater. I'm going to start off again with the lightest color, again using those lines or the detail within the image to my advantage to create that texture as well as the shadows. There would be a shadow where her arm meets the rest of the sweater, and also just putting those little flick lines where those lines within the image are. My darkest color is actually an orange. So a lot of times when I am coloring something yellow, I will either use an orange or more of a brown tone for my shadow color. But as you blend this out, it will still appear to be yellow. I am just creating a shadow underneath his hand and underneath where the collar of her shirt is. I wasn't sure which color I wanted to color the ribbon, I guess it would be. And I ultimately used the same color combination, but I did save that for last. I'm also using the same color combination for the ribbon on her hat as well. My lightest color is very bright, and I'm using the yellow or orangey yellow with the blue just because they are complementary colors, so they do go well together. So I did forget the highlight color for the ribbon on her hat, but I will go back to that once I notice that when you color multiple images at one time within one stamp, sometimes I miss things. So we'll move on to his pants, and I'm starting off with the C1, which will be my lightest color, to get those areas mapped out. The shadows are going to be, his legs are bent up, so the part of his pants that are behind his knees would cast a shadow, also where the little zipper on his pants would be. On the inside of his pants, just because his feet are kind of faced out, I guess you could say. And also those little lines that are within the image, I'm using those, as well as creating just a few more myself. My darkest color is the actual black marker, but I'm using this very sparingly, and I'm barely touching the tip of the marker to the paper. I don't want to saturate the paper too much with the black because it is very difficult to blend out. Next, moving on to the C7 and blending all of those areas out a little bit further. And I'm using this color a little bit more than I use the black, and creating a shadow underneath where his hand is resting on his knee as well. Moving on to the C5 and extending these areas out even further. And I'm using this even more than I use the C7. Each time I go down, I'm using a little bit more, just preserving a little bit of a highlight for the C1, just because I don't want his pants to appear to be too light. I still want them to be like a dark gray or a black. So you'll want to make sure that you're using that C1 pretty sparingly, just like you did with the actual black marker. You can see that I'm just leaving a very, very tiny highlight right on his knees. So once the C1 is filled in, I'm going to move on to his shirt, his button-down shirt, and I want this to appear white as well. So I'm using that same C5, C3, and C1, using just the very tip of my marker to create that shadow with the C5, which will be underneath his collar, as well as where his jacket is laying over his shirt. Also, there's a few little wrinkles right there over his belly, and I'm using that to create some texture as well. Now, for an image like this, because there is so much detail to it with these lines and these flick lines, and you can tell without this being colored the texture that this image has. So you don't need to use this many colors. This image is great for beginner colorists and experienced colorists, because you can add as much detail as you want, or you can leave out as much detail as you want. As long as you're stamping with a black ink, those lines are going to remain there. So even if you just use a 2 or 3 color combination, or even color in some of the smaller areas solid, you're still going to get that texture within the lines of the image itself. So all of this shading is not necessary. I'm just showing you guys so that you can kind of see how to add even more texture to this image or an image similar to this one. So here, as you can see, I've already colored his jacket, but pretty much doing the same thing as I've done this entire time, just obviously with a different color combination. For her little stockings, I want these to appear white, so I'm just using C3 and C1 and leaving a little bit of white space so that they still appear to be white. For her purse, I'm going to be using some darker C markers, and this will appear to be black or very dark gray, just concentrating some shading being on the bottom and where the flap of her purse is kind of hanging over the rest of it, as well as where the strap is around her arm. Also going to be using that same color combination for her shoes, and I'm just going to be creating a little bit of shading for this shoe. It's going to be towards like the toe because it's faced out. Her foot is faced out. And on the bottom, she kind of is resting the side of her foot down. So the bottom of that part would be the darkest as well. For his shoes, I'm going to be using a brown combination. I'm going to be using the E50 markers. And I'm not doing a whole lot of shading on these, but his shading would basically be where the heel of his foot is, as well as where his pants are kind of hanging over his shoes. Also using the same color combination for his belt, and I'm not doing a whole lot of shading there. There's not much of that belt that's actually showing. Once I had that done, I'm going to be using the same color combination for the park bench that they're actually sitting on. Now, typically I would add a wood grain texture to anything wooden that I'm coloring, but like I said before, this image already has that texture, so I don't need to add any more of it. I just need to add my shading as far as where my shadows will be. So I covered up the entire area with my lightest color, going to create a shadow behind her and on the bottom or on the base of each of the little boards that are part of the bench. Same thing for him, adding a shadow underneath where he's sitting and behind his arm there and on the bottom of each of those boards, blending that out with the E57. And I am using a little bit of a flicking motion because this is kind of a larger area and I tend to get a better blend when I use some flicking, but this is optional. Like I said, you already have that texture there, so if you haven't mastered the flick, it's perfectly fine. You'll never notice the difference. For these little birds, I'm going to be, oh no, I lie. For the, I guess the metal part of the bench, I'm going to switch over to some warm grays just because I use so many cool grays within the image itself. I didn't want to continue to use those. Normally I would use cool grays for any kind of metal object, but I didn't want it to blend in with everything else. So I did switch over to the warm grays. And now we'll move on to the little birds, and I'm going to be using some B90 markers. I did have a few areas that I was a little bit messy, so I'm just using the very tip of my colorless blender to kind of push that color where it needs to be. For the birds, I'm going to be using, like I said, B90 markers, and I'm only using 3 different colors here, and actually I didn't get all that much contrast here, but I am creating a shadow underneath the bird's wing and also where the birds are kind of behind one another. They're right directly next to each other, just like she is with him. But I am just creating just a little bit of a shadow and just using one solid color for the little tiny beak that's showing. Now for the ground, I'm not looking to get a whole lot of detail here. So I'm just taking my E31 and kind of scribbling where the dirt would be. This is going to be die cut down, so I'm not too concerned about it looking perfect at this point. I'm creating a shadow underneath her feet and his feet, and then under the little bench legs, I guess. And then a few little dots here and there with just the tip of my marker to add some texture to the dirt. Blending that out with the E33 and then going back in with the E31 to cover up the same area, basically. And I thought I extended this out or down far enough, but I ended up having to add a little bit more once this was die cut. I took a YG 97 marker just to add some blades of grass to kind of break up that ground a little bit, and there are some in the image, but I added a few more with just the tip of my marker just flicking out a bit. Next, I'll go ahead and die cut my image with a stitched square die, and that is just slightly larger than the image itself. I also die cut a larger stitched square from just a piece of plain Neenah Solar White. And you can see that I did have to add a little bit more ground to the image. I just didn't go far enough down. So I have a piece of Neenah Desert Storm here, and I'm just measuring my die cuts, and I totally measured wrong. It's I needed to cut this 4 1/4 by 4 1/4, and I cut it 5 1/4 by 5 1/4, but I ended up realizing my mistake and cut that down to 4 1/4 by 4 1/4 for this particular layer, and then for my larger stitched rectangle or stitched square, I cut this down to 4 3/4 by 4 3/4, and I'll adhere everything together with my Tombow Mono multi glue. I'm not popping anything up just because there are so many layers to this that I don't want it to be overly thick when I do, if I ever mail this actually. And this is obviously going to be a square card. So I have a card base that is going to be 5 by 5. And so I cut a piece of Neenah 110 pound to 10 by 5, scored that at 5, and I'll use my bone folder to crease that. And Frankie's making a very, very brief appearance here. And I will go ahead and adhere everything down onto my card panel and kept this as is. I didn't feel like it needed any white gel pen details or sparkle or anything like that. I think it's good the way it is. So that is the card for today, guys. Thanks a lot for stopping by, and have a great day. Bye.